Hey.
Hi guys, welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. Tonight's session is an open session, so basically I'm at your mercy. I already saw a few questions come in, but this session really relies on you guys asking your questions so that we have something to talk about. I don't want to have a short session tonight. I'd like to keep it going as long as our typical sessions, but if we don't have anything pop up, then it's a short session. And if it's a short session, we won't have that many things to cover. But that said, I'm gonna, now that you know that, if you do have anything you want to discuss, type it into chat. Like I said, I saw a few things pop up. What I'm gonna do in the meantime is I'm gonna show off our image of the week, which, stop me if you cannot see it, but this is an image of IC 1318 by Adam Landefeld. Of course, a narrowband image, 18 hours in the Hubble palette with a Skywatch Esprit 120 and a QSI 6120. And again, one of these images that does not require a massive telescope, but has a lot of reach. Really digs deep in there, and the smaller sensor on the QSI 6120, I think, is what lets you get that that reach and that kind of beautiful field of view, particularly for deep inside of nebula, which is what I would say basically a favorite of mine, just digging deep inside the nebula. As always, you guys can pop over onto our website, and since I have it here, I'll show it off to you. Hover over Image of the Week submission. And if you scan down here, then you can click Browse, upload your file, your name, the object name, and the description, and then you're basically up into consideration. But the other thing I want you guys to do is go onto our website, check out some of the past images of the weeks, and just look at some of these great submissions. If you see a duplicate, it's my fault for not pulling it out of there. I'll get rid of some of those, but look, a great solar image, image of the corona, nice Veil Nebula. We get awesome submissions here, just some great imagers in general. So that's why we like having you on and kind of sharing stuff. Okay. Got to take back my window. There we go. Oh, yeah, and that's a good point. We do still, we don't charge you to watch this thing. We don't make any money off of this channel, but what we do is we sell T-shirts to cover some of our expenses. I think it's been about a year since we switched over to the new website, which is basically what brought all of our expenses up, and we've done a great job covering them, but in a few months we're going to get hit by a few more bills, basically domain registration, the chat bill, and a few others. So if you want a T-shirt, wish I had one on me or beside me, but I don't. I have them at work for easy shipping. But if you want a T-shirt, go onto our website. You can, it basically takes you through what you need to do. Specify the size, because a lot of times people forget to specify the size, and then I have to go on back and forth and ask you, and just takes a little bit more time. Otherwise, I could get it right out. But yeah, T-shirts are available. And if you don't want a T-shirt, but you just want to just help us out with some of our bills, feel free to do the same on our website. Support TAIC. Anything helps. Like I said, we don't make money here. We've actually turned down some sponsors because we don't want to necessarily, well, first of all, it's a lot of responsibility. Then it becomes a business. And if you're doing this for business, you're probably not having as much fun as you should. Not that they weren't good people, just that basically we've been doing it on our own for a while. So the T-shirts kind of give us a way to help out. That was a pretty long-winded way to say, hey guys, buy my T-shirts. But there you go. Okay, so I'm gonna jump up now. I'm hoping most of you guys have access to chat. of course, on our website, theastroimagingchannel.com, bottom right, little bouncy thing. Click it, and you will be in chat. You can ask your questions right out. First question we have, asking about our process for polar alignment. I will, let me one more time do the long-winded process here. Before I got probably my most favorite piece of equipment, my right angle polar alignment scope for my astrophysics mount, I was using the astrophysics routine, which basically involves using a specific tool, the meridian delay feature, and flipping the mount and pointing at the same star over and over again, and refining your alignment that way. This is for basically a precise polar alignment, as opposed to just a rough polar alignment that you would use for visual. But it basically, by flipping the PR over and over and over again, then you refine using the pointing of the mount, and within, I would say, 10 minutes, you're pretty well polar aligned. That said, after I used that method for a while, PhD Guiding introduced a new polar alignment method, or at least a tool, I should say, for polar alignment within their software. And I was able to use that. I'm not going to say it was quicker, but it gave me a little bit better visual response, and I could just watch the graph and make my adjustments. I could literally walk away from the mount for 5 minutes, walk back, make a slight adjustment, walk away. So it kind of worked into my whole routine a little bit better. And I began using that. I had also used the polar alignment tool in PemPro for a short period of time, but I actually just preferred PhD. And you know, you have to have PhD open anyway. You have to calibrate PhD, or possibly if you're permanent, well, if you're permanent, you're not really worrying about polar alignment so much, but you have to calibrate PhD. You've got the window open. You're basically working in the same program, which I think saves time and prevents any sort of other issues. It's probably happened to all of us. You have guiding open. You have your capture program open. One of them crashes. And then, well, you kind of have to start all over with everything. By dealing with one fewer program, it kind of simplifies everything. But my life changed. It wasn't just my observatory that changed my life, but yeah, my observatory changed my life because all of a sudden I didn't have to polar align every night. It made everything a lot more fun. But astrophysics introduced the right angle polar alignment scope, which just, I don't know, it just works. You literally screw the polar alignment scope on, you look through the reticle, you look at your phone and figure out where in the reticle Polaris should be, and you are done. It is, I should say, you align the mount and then you're done. It is about as easy of a routine as I've ever seen. And it's that under 5-minute routine. It just works. But Glenn's comment, and not all of us have a mount where the polar alignment scope gives you good enough alignment to actually use for imaging, particularly long focal length imaging. Glenn's comment is he's had enough issues with the other thing. His order for PoleMaster is going to be coming. And we had done a show on PoleMaster. It is basically a camera that goes on your scope somewhere, wherever basically you can mount it, and kind of runs a routine similar to that of PhD, but you move your mount, and by doing that, you get a very, very accurate polar alignment, probably better than the right angle polar alignment scope. Probably as good as PhD alignment would be, but I don't know. It's what I will say. PoleMaster is probably the second best polar alignment routine out there besides the right angle polar alignment scope. So a question from Victor in Brazil. How do you process different exposure images to a single one? And I'm not exactly sure what you're asking here, so I will paraphrase your question and answer that, because there are beginners out there. And if it's more complex than the beginner question that I'm paraphrasing, please just elaborate on it. But how do we, okay, this is for the beginners. How do we take multiple sets of exposures? You hear we image for 8 hours, 20 hours, 40 hours. How do we take those multiple sets of exposures and combine them into one? Well, first of all, why do we need to do that? Obviously, you can't take a 20-hour exposure of the night sky because it gets to be daytime. So we take the equivalent of 20-hour exposures and we break them up into bits. Oh, Victor, you left the conversation. Well, let me keep going. We break them up into bits. So basically, we determine what a good sub-exposure time would be. We've had shows basically that deal with that itself. But basically, depending on your light pollution, depending on the moon phase, depending on whether you're using narrowband filters, RGB filters, or a luminance filter, that optimal exposure time is going to be different. So what we end up doing is we weigh a few factors, or just through experience, we determine how exposed, how much light we want to consider the perfect amount. We can use the ADU in our cameras, the ADU value, or the histogram to give us some visual cues to that. And then we just take that exposure over and over and over again. And we might end up with 20, 50, 100 exposures. So from there, before we get into what would be the answer of your question, which I might as well say it now, before we get into the stacking or combining of those exposures, we want to calibrate. And the most important thing about calibration would be flat calibration, which basically takes the uneven illumination that exists in basically all optical systems and removes it. I don't want to use the word subtracts it, because it's not subtracting it. It's dividing it to get the math correct. But by getting the math correct, it ends up removing that uneven illumination. And you would probably notice this as well. The edges of your images tend to be darker. Center tends to be bright. By getting the math right, you're actually maintaining the signal-to-noise ratio throughout, or for the most part, maintaining the signal-to-noise ratio throughout. But you're also just getting it ready to look pretty. An image with a well-processed image with without flat calibration and without that correction is going to look a little bit funny. Even you don't notice it with daytime photos that much, but even normal camera lenses have some light fall off in the corners. And when you're taking a daytime photo, I think our eyes are used to kind of seeing that. When you take a deep sky photo, it really stands out because it's on a black background. You see a lot of differences between a black background or a close to black background and a slightly brightened interior. It makes a huge difference. So we end up flat, well, we end up calibrating it, flats being the most important. We also take darks and bias frames, which are just one further way of calibrating it out. But then, getting to the answer of your question, you basically just combine the exposures. We use a few different tools. Some of us use PixInsight. Some of us use Deep Sky Stacker. I believe, let me think, CCD Stack does it. There are a few tools out there. I'm going to say Deep Sky Stacker is probably the best for beginners because it's free. And from there, when you start using it and getting into it, then you might change to one of the more expensive paid programs. A lot of us in the room really swear by PixInsight for our stacking. I think the calibration and stacking routine in PixInsight just performs a lot better than Deep Sky Stacker. It's a paid program, it should. But they also offer a few different algorithms for stacking, and you can pick the one you want. But in general, what is stacking? Okay, stacking is averaging the exposures. Internally, depending on the routine you're using, it'll first combine, or excuse me, it'll first align the images so that your stars all line up. Then it will stack them. And it's basically averaging them together. At the pixel level, it's averaging them together. So a raw average is going to work the noise out. Okay. Let me finish this quickly and move into that. So basically, yeah, we average them out. You have a few different ways to deal with pixels that are odd or don't seem right. You can toss out pictures that fall out of a specific range. You can set that range within certain programs. And basically, that's where you get to dig deep into the stacking programs. You'll see the algorithms. Basically, the different algorithms are rejection algorithms, and it determines what to do with those pixels that aren't quite right. Hopefully that made sense. Because I see that Victor's question is actually a little bit different than what I answered, and Glenn is also asking a similar question. So Victor from Brazil, exposures with different times, 10 200 second, 10 300 second. So it, in a sense, depends on why you took those different exposure times. If you took those different exposure times to get more dynamic range out of your image, in other words, Orion Nebula is very bright at the center, so we'll take very short exposures for the center and very long exposures to get the outside of it. Then you're going to stack them individually, the 10 300 seconds and the 10 200 seconds individually, and combine them in a separate program, likely by masking off the outer edge and then the inner edge and combining them just to make it look pretty. If you're asking, kind of in a sense of what Glenn is asking, stacking different exposure days, basically the way I do it is I just stack them together. You can, if you have the difficulty comes a little bit in calibration, because you do have to make sure that the calibration for each of those images is proper. 10 200 second exposures and 10 300 second exposures are going to use different dark frames, or you're going to want to scale your darks. Preferably, you would use different dark frames, but then you would end up having to calibrate those 10 200 seconds, calibrate those 300 seconds, and then combine the 20 exposures together. And you may end up having to tweak the algorithm just so you're not rejecting the lower signal to noise ratio images, which would be the 200 seconds. That said, the 200 second could potentially have higher signal to noise ratio depending on other factors. It basically depends on a few things. But calibrate them properly first and then combine them, and you're basically safe.
I'll add that the new local normalization tools in PixInsight are very good at dealing with those differences, right? It's difficult to deal with the signal-to-noise ratio differences you get, even sometimes within a single night if you have a lot of variation, much less, differences in exposure times.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, because that was actually difficult for some of the earlier tools to deal with. But if you do get them normalized, then in essence, you've got the backgrounds matched up and you've got the bright spots matched up. So it's just a matter of combining. So it just does that much of a better job.
I can add a couple other points on the other part of that, Adam, if you want me to. So the other question is really, like you said, you know, doing HDR imaging, right, where you're trying to extend the dynamic range. And in this case, there are different tools. PixInsight has an HDR combination tool. There's an HDR. I think there's a couple different ways to do HDRs in Photoshop. There's other tools in, you know, PaintShop Pro and other standalone tools and stuff like this that you can use to take different length exposures or different, you know, if you're using DSLR, different ISO levels or things like this to combine them together. And the whole point of that is really to extend the dynamic range so that you capture something that's brighter and darker all at the same time. And then really the whole point of the HDR is to compress that so it's visible on a screen or in print or things like that. But really you need one of those tools in order to combine those things together.
Cool. Thanks again, David. So Ryan's asking, he would like to hear about the exposure times for different objects, exposure times for galaxies versus nebula. In theory, okay, assuming that you're not trying to compare apples to oranges, we're talking either we're talking RGB or color, just one-shot color camera. The exposures for a galaxy and a nebula should really be the same because you're basically worrying about the background. When you're determining your exposure, you want the background sky to come up off of the noise floor. So in theory, just by getting that background sky off the noise floor up, you have gotten the optimal exposure.
Adam.
Yes.
Adam, I get this question a lot, almost every day. How much off the noise floor?
How much off the noise floor? Okay, so it depends on, well, I shouldn't say it depends on the tool you're using to look at it, but if you're using a one-shot color camera and you're relying on the histogram, then basically you just want that spike to be separated from the left side. If you are using a CCD camera and it gives you your values, your pixel values in ADU units, then you may have you can always convert that to a histogram and look at the histogram and see if it's off of the noise floor. But you can, with the ADU values, you can do a little bit more math to try and figure out exactly how far away from it. And the rule of thumb had been 5%, right? What can someone help me out with the rule of thumb? What is it? 5% of how does it go?
Adam, can I help out?
Oh, go ahead, Alex.
No, David, I think you know more about this stuff than that.
The rule of thumb has always been you want your read noise contribution to be only 5% of your total noise. Right. That's always been the rule of thumb that I think most people have used. Right. So when you use these calculators and stuff, that's effectively what it's trying to do. Read noise contribution is no more than 5% of the total noise in the image.
So you can use one of the calculators. You can use the simple calculators, which ask you which camera you have. And I'm trying to think what else they would ask you. Which camera you have. Do they ask you? I'm confusing tools here because I know Sequence Generator Pro tries to estimate it from an image. But the other tools, I forget how that works.
A lot of them will use like your CCD characteristics, where you put in your gain and your read noise and your full well depth and things like that, and we can estimate from there.
Oh, okay.
Typically you still do have to have some sort of sample image to understand what the background value is for a certain exposure time, right? So you can use that information.
Yeah, it popped into my head as I was thinking about that. So what those tools do is they most likely tell you the background value you're aiming for.
It's effectively what they're trying to get to. Is they're trying to get to an ideal background value that is photon shot limited rather than read noise or dark current limited, if possible. Right.
Yeah, basically what you wind up doing is you take an image that has been bias subtracted and dark subtracted, and you check to see what the level is on the background sky, which is a dark part of the sky. Most programs that you're using, all you have to do is put your cursor on a dark area of the sky, and it will give you an ADU reading. I know that from my QSI 583, it's supposed to be at 1350. Okay, so I take a calibrated dark subtracted image, and I just put the cursor there, and if it's not at 1350, then I need to, if it's lower than that, I need to increase my exposure. If it's more than that, I need to decrease my exposure. Practically speaking, what most of us find out is that we tend to image from the same place night after night. Now, not counting the moon, but if you're talking under general conditions where it's a moonless night, stuff like that, we wind up taking the same exposures over and over again. So for most of us, I think, we know that our cameras are going to want to run for 8 minutes to get the ideal exposure. Now, this thing where you use the 5% figure, that's an important thing, and it's been used for a long time, and it is quite useful. However, it's not the only thing you have to consider. For instance, Victor's original question this evening was about images taken at different exposure levels. For instance, if you're taking the Orion Nebula, you want to have short exposures to catch that trapezium area, and you want to have long exposures to catch the nebulosity out in the distance. Well, you have to take different exposures for that. Same thing, if you want to take a picture of a globular cluster, your background stars may not, or your background may not mean too much. If you're going for open clusters, you're going to want color. So you always have to make sure that you don't exceed the exposure that would blow out your stars. If you click on a star and it says that it's at 255 in red, 255 in green, 255 in blue, well, you know that there's no more place to go. You don't know that if in fact it might have been at 300, but it can't read any more than 255, so it might be a bluer star than you think. So you have to get all three of those numbers so that they're in the 245, 250 range at the most. One of them is there, and then if the other one is, like if you get red 250 and blue and green at 210, it's going to be a reddish star, and that's how you get your star color. Well, if you just went strictly with the sky background, you might have blown out too many stars. Now, you're going to blow out some, but you have to be careful with that. There is no single answer to what the proper exposure is, but for nebulosity and for galaxies, which are also nebulous objects, you generally want to try to go with the 5% rule. But if you're looking for a particular color in stars, you might want to go less than that in order to pull it off. And the reason you go with the 5% is the thinking was that once you've gotten background noise level down to about 5% of the overall, your picture's not going to get much better. Your noise, you've already lost the noise. It's gone pretty much from your picture. So rather than wait for a satellite to go through or the dog to kick the tripod or whatever, stop that exposure and start the next exposure. And that's why you go with 5% instead of 3% or 1% or 0.5% or anything like that. It's just that by 5%, it's gone. The noise is gone. So go ahead and stop the exposure and start yourself a whole new exposure.
I'll add 2 additional things to this. Another driving factor is how long you can expose.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you have a really, long focal length and you don't have the best mount or things like that, you're not going to be able to expose for long. So, you'll have additional limitations in place. If you're just starting out, you're going to want to start with short exposures. Don't worry about, how long it is. Just take a bunch of short exposures and go with that. If you're not guiding or things like that, there's lots of things that affect it. I think I was going to make another point, and I forgot what that was, but it's okay.
Mike Martis, what about stacking images taken from 2 different format cameras? The difficulty in that is actually was touched upon earlier by David when he brought up the normalization tools. Basically, you've got to be able to normalize the images. You've got to kind of have them have consistencies in their basically in their levels. And if David interrupts me here, I would be happy as anything, because when we do these large collaborations, we usually dump a whole lot of data on David Black because he tends to be the expert at this.
Yeah, I can talk a bit about it.
Awesome, David. Thank you.
Dealing with all these different image scales and different setups is pretty difficult sometimes. If your actual image data is pretty similar, it's not that bad. And by that I mean that if you measure the full width half maximum in arc seconds and it's all about the same, signal to noise ratios are about the same, then all it's really doing is you just need to make sure that things get scaled to the appropriate image scale. And generally you'd want to use the larger image scale of the 2 data sets so that you end up with something that's at least sampled as well as your best case scenario. But realistically, there's a lot of issues that crop into that. You'll find if you have data taken with a really wide field instrument and you're trying to combine it with something with a very narrow field, that the image scale is so large for the large scale one that you can't capture the resolution. So you get these really massive stars and everything like this spread out. It's kind of blurry relative to your other data, and it doesn't combine well. Things like that tend to work better if you do like inset images where you blow up the center part or whatever it is you're trying to highlight inside the frame, rather than actually trying to combine the data. So it's really just kind of dependent upon all the data you're working with, what it will allow you to do. Ultimately, most of the stacking software out there allows you to deal with some amount of image scale difference in your data sets. So PixInsight can definitely handle a large range. DSS can handle a pretty narrow range. There's some other tools out there that can handle larger ranges as well. I don't know how well CCD Stack deals with this. Astro Image Processing, I think that one does pretty well. It's a little closer to PixInsight in its capabilities for stacking stuff, but there's definitely options out there for dealing with those.
Thank you, David. Alex, will your trial jeopardize your existing paid license on an earlier edition for what?
Oh, well, so for some reason, the chat program seems to be blowing up tonight. I've gotten tossed out several times. That goes with an earlier question. I want to try the free trial for Adobe Photoshop, but I've got a perfectly good CS6 that I use all the time, and I've been avoiding going to the subscription model all this time. So my question is, if I download the free trial, am I going to start getting all sorts of problems with my existing paid license on CS6?
Well, I have constant problems with my existing paid license on CC, I guess it is.
Adam,
no, you know what? That may be it.
I think I know what's going to happen. If you install the trial, it uninstalls the other programs.
Does it?
Yeah, I think I went through that when I reluctantly agreed to go to the current version because I was working with someone else who only had that, and we had some format issues. And yes, it uninstalled all the other programs. And
yeah, I don't want that to happen.
I'm sure that's Adobe. They don't want you to go back. They want you to go to the subscription model.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to go there. Thank you for answering that, Eric.
The installer is kind of a pain. The installer and Creative Commons, I don't know what they call it, CC. It's
Subscription.
There's like an additional program that acts as an installer. Like basically, you have to download that to get Photoshop, and then they want to sell you Lightroom and all this stuff. So like it's an extra program running on your computer that doesn't have to be there.
Okay.
But if you want to see
Now, let me go back to something that David and you guys were talking about as far as different formats and things like that. Bob Gendler, I think it was, yeah. Well, I hope it was, but it was somebody at AIC a couple of years back was talking about how he takes public archived information, Hubble shots, and he puts them together with his shots. Obviously, we're talking different formats here. Various, like lots of different kinds of formats. Most image processing programs have a registration subpart that takes care of that kind of stuff. Now, it's not easy necessarily, but it certainly can be done. So if you've had your DSLR going out and taking color pictures, and you want to use them as the color for your luminance that you've got out of your mono CCD, certainly give it a try. You know, there's no reason you can't go ahead and give that a try. You may have pixel size mismatches and stuff like that, as David was talking about, but don't be discouraged from doing it at all just because there's, you know, somebody might have said that it's hard to do.
Yeah, I probably should have made that clear. I certainly don't want to discourage people. If you have the data, or you have the equipment, or you're working with friends that have the equipment, definitely give it a shot. See what you can get.
It's just a registration. It's just the registration function in the image processing software. Star registration looks to see where there's a bright spot that's going to call a star, and it's going to match it to something else that looks like a star, that star in a different and it'll in a different sub-exposure from a different format, and it'll stretch and rotate and do whatever it needs to do to try to make them fit together.
Yeah, in the worst case, there are generally tools as well that allow you to manually align. So if the image scale is just so far that your tool can't do it, for example, PixInsight has a dynamic alignment tool that allows you to do it manually, right? So that you can override it and say, no, really, this star is this star. I know what I'm talking about. Go put it in the same location as the star in this other image, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, Deep Sky Stacker doesn't do that. In fact, it requires that all the images are pretty much same size.
Yeah, its stacking algorithm is definitely a little on the limited side.
And we pay good money for that.
That's right. It's hard to argue with free.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Use one camera and get it done.
Ryan's asked a question. He had to leave, but he wants he wants to know, I think it was Ryan wanted to know about the definition of bias, flats, darks. How do you take them and all that other stuff? Let's make that a whole show. You know, I don't mind doing a show like that, and it is within my little ballpark that I can actually handle. So if you give me a while, I can do that. Okay, Ryan? It's just like it's not difficult exactly, but it does take a lot of explaining to do it right.
Honestly, this is bias, flats, and darks. Well, I will say bias and dark frames are really easy.
Yeah.
You can follow instructions and take your calibration frames and not have any issues with them. Flats get a little bit more, I don't want to say, well, a little bit more difficult, but a little bit more can go wrong. There are a few more factors that you have to concentrate on. Bias and darks are taken with the lens cap on. So it's basically just about the exposure time, and biases are as fast of an exposure as you can take, and darks are darks should match your lights in exposure time. Flats deserve their own show in addition to the calibration show.
I think we've had one, haven't we? Didn't we have a show just on flats?
I think we did have a show.
Yeah.
guess.
The fellow from NEAC came and did
Yeah.
one for us.
Yep.
Incidentally, I mentioned AIC. For those of you who don't know what AIC is, it's the gathering of all the world's greatest imagers. Huh, Eric? Eric's been there. And I've been there too, by the way. You don't have to be a great imager to go there. They let me in. But it happens at San Jose every 2 years now. What?
Proof positive you don't have to be a great imager to go there. We both go.
Yeah, okay. Well, but at least you've got, anyway, that's not the point. The point is coming up at the end of this month, AIC's up there. If you really want to see some cool equipment, they've got a vendor's corner there. They've got all sorts of presenters coming. They've got some ranges for some Photoshop. They've got PixInsight work. They've got, they're going to do some planetary work. I don't remember solar, but maybe there. So, I mean, these are guys that really know what they're doing, that you're just rubbing shoulders with right in there in San Jose. So if you can at all get there, it's a good thing to do.
Guillermo, hi everyone. Suppose we want to capture 60 minutes of the Orion Nebula. Would it be best to have 12 5-minute exposures, or would it be best to have 6 1-minute exposures? I understand that having more shots, noise reduces, and having more exposure time would give us more dynamic range. So which one would be the best? Well, first of all, you picked the wrong target to ask on, because it totally, again, the Orion Nebula. Is it a difficult target to shoot, or is it an easy target to shoot? Both. It has bright spots and it has dark spots. So to expose the inside of it, or to image the inside of it, you need really fast exposures. To image the outside of it, you can settle for normal length exposures. So I'm going to try not to speak to that specific nebula, and I'm just going to answer the question, would it be best to have 12 5-minute exposures, or would it be best to have 60 1-minute exposures? And that depends, that goes back to what we were speaking about earlier. It is best to have the shortest exposure you possibly can, but also have it separate from the read noise enough. Shorter exposures limit plane trails, limit bumping the mount, limit basically all of that stuff. You only want to go long enough that you've separated yourself from the read noise, and then you might as well just start the new exposure and go over and over and over again. But what is that time? Well, it depends on how long you can image in your sky. Light pollution, the filter you're using, basically all of that is going to determine that individual sub-exposure time. Noise reduces over time. It's not necessarily having more shots itself that reduces the noise. Having more individual subs can actually reduce like some of the granulation of it, but the actual signal to noise ratio just kind of scales with time, assuming the same increment of exposure. And yes, so then over time you're broadening the dynamic range. But which one would be best? It kind of completely depends on your setup. It's one of those things where we have to kind of speak conceptually, because if you can understand the concept, then you can get it right. But we can't really give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instructions on this one. We can give you some rules of thumb, but then you have to kind of go from there.
It's also been a lot more complicated, and things are changing now with what are sometimes called isoless cameras and stuff like that, where there are an awful lot of people taking hundreds, 1,000 short exposures on their CCD cameras and putting them together. If you want an answer to this that will give you lots and lots and lots of reading, just go over to Cloudy Nights, and about every 5th or 8th thread is about this very issue. And I don't think it's all settled yet. You've heard the theory. Don't get too hung up in theory. Take some pictures tonight or tomorrow night or whatever, and see what worked really well for you, and see which of the subs you liked better for your camera and your setup and your imaging situation. That's always a good answer.
So Victor, talk about books on astrophotography. I wish I had my bookshelf here, because or I should say, I think I have a stack of them in the other room. The books that I've bought on astrophotography, well, first, because we're PixInsight processors, and because PixInsight is very complex, basically the must-have reading, in my opinion, is Warren Keller's new book, Inside PixInsight. But that applies only to PixInsight. So if you don't have PixInsight, you don't need it. That said, if you have PixInsight, or you're considering PixInsight, or you're you just want to waste a few hours and you've downloaded the trial of PixInsight, this book will still be very valuable to you. It's what I believe most of the people in the room did not have anything like this. And PixInsight's documentation is notoriously complex.
No, it isn't. It isn't even there.
What is there is complex. What isn't there isn't there. But Warren does a great job of breaking it down into step-by-step process. You know, some of us think about things conceptually, and some of us just want instructions, and it just kind of depends on which way you want to go. PixInsight had always required you to have the concept down, a complex concept. I think Warren did a great job of just giving you those ABC instructions.
You know, somebody asked me that question today. Like, how they looked at PixInsight and they asked me, "How did you learn PixInsight?" Well, I told them, watching the show.
Yeah.
90% of my knowledge came from watching you guys. You know, somebody says something, or you pick up a tip.
By the way, I've got to throw in here, because I do this all the time. Warren's going to be out in Southern California in a couple of weeks, Warren Keller, and doing a workshop. And if you get into, what's it, telescopes, no, telescopes.com, or is it telescope.net, the Woodland Hills website, you can get information about coming out to see Warren for $50. He's going to be there all day. You get a free lunch and dinner out of that, and get to camp and fart around and all that other cool stuff. So if you want to meet Warren, he's going to be out there. But Victor is probably not going to fly up from Brazil. I hope you can, but you know, if you can't, depends on what you're looking for. There are some really good classic books that everybody refers to over and over again. I don't even know the names of some of these, but Russell Croman and does some. Scott Ireland has the best book on Photoshop. However, it is now, what, 15 years old. But if you want to learn the basics of Photoshop, our Scott Ireland does the best book for that. Its name is Photoshop for Astro Images, or something like that. My books are all currently packed over in a corner because I was building a garage, so everything got moved around. If you go to Jerry's website, Jerry Rodriguez's website, he doesn't put out books, but he does put out CDs that are in book format, kind of. And Jerry is just a wonderful person in the first place, but more importantly, he gives away so much information. Well, he finally packaged some of these packages at reasonable prices, $29, something like that, dollars. Or go look at Jerry Rodriguez's Lodriguss website. Somebody can look it up and
Astropix.
Astropix.
PIX.
And he's got one on imaging in general. He's got another on using your DSLR, and those are both very good books. Who did the 101 photographic images, or 101? Everybody seems to like that. It's very good for showing you what other people have done to take images of various objects and stuff like that. I'm not so sure it goes through the nitty gritty of how to take the pictures, but who's the guy that sat next to me at AIC 4 years ago that put out that book that he was giving away? I cannot remember. The new CCD. Who wrote that one?
Wadowski?
Ron Wadowski's. That was the Bible for a long time. Still is very good, obviously. Well, one of the problems is, of course, things are changing all the time. So, Victor, that's my collection, and I'm sure the other guys have some others that they can mention. But those are the ones I'd go. I'd go with Wadowski. If you're really technical, was it James Burnell? Was it from AI? Astro for Windows or something like that. If you really want to learn the theory behind the numbers, that's where all that came from. Astro for Windows, Astro Imaging for Windows or something like that. I forget. James Burnell. Anyway, somebody else's turn.
If you really want to get lost in details of how CCD sensor works and things like that, I would recommend this one. It is Handbook of CCD Astronomy by Steve B. Howell. Very, very excellent. I really like this book, but it is very technical. So beware if you want to get it. There's a lot of other really great books out there that are less technical than that. But if you want to have a deep understanding, that's a good one to go to.
Yeah, I will back up what Alex said with Jerry Rodriguez's book, particularly for DSLR astrophotography. He really takes you through everything, and there's actually probably enough info on his website alone to get you started, just to wet your feet. But once you do it once, you're going to have a few questions, and then I think that's where his books on CD come in. Is there an adequate cooling temperature for imaging? Of course, it's relative to the place you're imaging, but which temperature should be the best for a sensor? So basically, well, I don't want to say the cooler you can get it, the better, because as you cool your sensor, the thermal noise or the dark current, the dark noise will go down. And it's I don't know if it's a linear relationship, but it's a pretty steady drop as the temperature goes down. But there is like a point where it stops improving because you've eliminated most of that noise. But the balance is cooling your sensor. First of all, takes power. Not all CCD cameras can cool to infinity. They're limited in what they can cool. So when you're out imaging, and if you are imaging in Pennsylvania tonight, there's no problem. I wouldn't have any problem probably taking my camera to -20. It's 50 degrees outside, 50 Fahrenheit outside, and that's -20 Celsius, by the way. It's 50 degrees Fahrenheit outside, so it's fairly cool. My sensor will get there, and my cooler will be working at about 80% efficiency, maybe 85% efficiency. But if it was 70 or 80 outside, my cooler would have to be working at 100% efficiency, which just isn't really good, because if it gets a little bit warmer, then all of a sudden I'm not hitting that fixed temperature point that I need to be at. And maintaining that temperature point is important for calibration. I want my lights, my sub-exposures, to be the same length as my calibration frames, but I also want them to be the same temperature as my calibration frames so that the noise matches up. So basically, it kind of depends on your sensor and with your camera. And with your sensor, the 8300, the benefits of cooling start to fall off at about -20. And if I can hit -20, I'm more than happy with that. There are other things that creep up. If you cool your camera too much, and you can actually hit that sensor, you can have other issues. I know with some sensors, residual bulk image, RBI, can creep in with excessive cooling, and basically it imprints the previous image on the next image. It just doesn't fully clear the sensor out or read the sensor out, and it leaves some residual image in there. I mean, you can have issues with frost if you cool too much, but basically the good cameras are designed to not have to deal with that. So depending on your sensor, you can look at the dark current curve on your sensor, see where it levels out, see where you want to be, where you're comfortable being on that graph, and then determine it from there. My personal experience with an SBIG STF 8300 is I want to get it to -20, but in the summer I can't, so I settle for -10. And I know the reason I don't go -18, -17, -15 is because I want to pick one and stick to it for basically 6 or 8 months out of the year, then pick my other temperature and stick to it so that I have fewer calibration frames to worry about. Oh yeah, and I see that question was answered right below. Well, Guillermo, your camera can go to -40, but you don't want to push it too much. Use it at -10 and reach 0 to 5% sensor temp. Okay, let me think about that. -40. Which kind of camera is this? Because this, I just want to make sure that this is a fixed. Oh wow, there are a ton of questions below there. Well, either way, so the key to cooling a camera is you want to be able to set the temperature that the sensor is at. You don't just want to cool it a certain temperature below ambient, because then the temperature, the sensor temperature, isn't actually fixed. That's what most astronomical CCDs do, is they let you say -40, enter, okay. The camera cools down to the sensor the camera cools the sensor down to -40, and then it holds it there. It is not -40 below ambient. It is -40. And he's shooting an ASI 071 CMOS, and I'm not 100% familiar with that camera, but the important thing to pay attention to is whether it's set point cooling or just cooling. Which is basically what I had just spoken to, whether it's ambient, below ambient, or actual fixed.
I think that's set point cooling, and it should be -40 below ambient that it's capable of reaching. Right.
Okay.
So if it's 0 degrees outside, then you could theoretically set it to -40, but you'll never really get there because you can't really run it stably at 100%. The thermal cooling system, right? So,
a good rule of thumb is get it as cold as it can possibly get and still be running at about 80%.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then you've got enough headroom for if it does get a whiff of warm air coming through there and it kind of wants to warm up, it'll go up to 90%, but it'll still keep you at that same temperature. So get it as cold as you could possibly get it and still be cooking along at about 80%. Now, if you're running off a battery, there might be some other considerations. But if you've got AC power coming in, go for it.
Does anyone have experience with the APCC software? I do not believe anyone in the room does. If anyone does, let me know. But I think we've all, for some reason, all of our systems have allowed us to do a lot of that stuff, or at least run our systems the way we want without using APCC. If you're remote, it might give you a little bit more features, but I don't believe any of us do.
If I'm not mistaken, this is the software that gives the pointing model, adds the pointing model to the astrophysics. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a software that allows you to, I believe, download another software, buy another software that will give you pointing model, right? Because APCC still requires pinpoint. Does that sound right?
I think it's pinpoint, yeah.
And Maxim.
And Maxim, yes, yes.
Yeah, you got to control the camera and then plate solve it. So one cool feature about the APCC that I like is that you can literally take your telescope and your mount and slew it around until it barely touches your, well, just not just off your tripod, and it will map that out, and it won't go to those ever. It won't even slew through those places, not even go there. That's a pretty cool feature APCC has. So pretty much it avoids pure collisions.
That's a good point.
It has modeling too, so it has really cool features.
Alex, is AIC good for beginners?
And I answered that further down below. It's not designed for beginners, but I don't think that there's ever any of these presentations that just hit the beginners. From what I've seen, David can attest to this. I know Josh can attest to this, because you guys have done presentations with me at RTMC, at Nightfall, things like this. There's always going to be some beginners that are just absolutely mystified. But most of them go out of the show thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't know it could even do that. And now I know it can do that. I can't remember how he did it, but I know it can be done. So all I have to do is go home and figure out how to do it. And I find a lot of value in that. Now, if you're into buying equipment, oh sure, it is in many ways a better display of equipment than NEAF itself is, because it skips all the little things that you don't really need. It's all the top flight stuff, all the expensive stuff. People are there that have a lot of experience and really want to say something. Speaking of people who want to say something, go for it, Eric.
Yeah, I was going to add a couple of comments. It's really not, AIC is not designed for beginners, but most of the presentations have some elements in there that you can take away. And no one, whatever level of understanding, is going to go in there and take notes and be prepared to take an examination from what the speaker said. But there are always points you can pick up, whatever your level of expertise. In addition to that, they post the videos. And if you don't get it at the presentation and you remember something interesting in the topic, you can go back and listen to it again. But I would say anyone who is keenly interested in astrophotography, whatever their level of expertise, can gain something by going to AIC. Plus, as you said, it's really cool to see and rub elbows with all these people that are whose names you've heard and whose images you've admired. And most of them are just regular people you can go up and say hello to and start a discussion about imaging.
Yeah, these things are all just the rubbing of elbows. To find out that there's a guy, 20 miles down the road from where you live, you didn't even know he existed, and he's a imager that says, hey, come on over, we'll work up some images together and stuff like that. That stuff happens all the time. And it's an expensive proposition. Unless you live in the area, you're going to be paying for a hotel, you're going to be paying for the conference itself is 250, 300. What is it? It's like a poop load of money. You know, so it's an expensive proposition, but it's a lot of good stuff. Okay.
If you're keenly interested in astroimaging, I would say, and you can, go to AIC. It's like an eclipse. You won't regret the experience as long as it's clear.
Actually, it could even be raining in San Jose. You don't have to worry about it.
It was a joke, Alex.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Maybe I should. I'm going to mute me. Here, I'm mute.
Oh, okay. What is unity gain? I don't know. Maybe because I haven't been on Cloudy Nights so much recently, but
somebody quoted a link to one of the discussions about unity gain.
Yeah,
later on.
It seems like it used to be such a big deal because it was one of the few things we could kind of hang on to. What ISO should you be shooting at? The unity gain in general is where one electron of charge is converted to one ADU. So the thinking was, I don't know, what was it that you were actually limiting quantization error in it, or were you maximizing the dynamic range in it? Whichever it turned out to be, I think unity gain in essence was a little bit more overblown or wasn't quite the whole answer. It doesn't tell you enough about, or it doesn't explain enough about your camera to tell you, or your target for that matter, to tell you what ISO you should be using. So David's explaining below, outside of unit gain, multiple electrons may count as one ADU, or fractions of an electron may count as one ADU, depending on what you're trying to do. That said, if I'm way wrong here, please jump in, but I wouldn't focus too much on unity gain. Basically, it only applies to what? DSLRs.
Yeah, DSLRs and the newer crop of CMOS cameras, right? You can change the gain on it. It's gain and ISO are effectively the same thing.
Right.
And what you're really doing is you're changing how electrons are converted into digital units, and that has effects on things like how read noise is handled, full well depth, and you're effectively changing the characteristics of the sensor by changing the gain. So, you know, it can have benefits, you know, if you want to take advantage of them, but it has drawbacks at the same time. Like if you want to really kind of try to bring in more signal quickly, you know, push it up to, you know, half an electron counts for an ADU or something like this. But realize that your dynamic range is going to tank when you do that. So you're going to really compress the dynamic range by doing so. So if you go out and search for, you know, I think it's DxO Mark or things like this, have a whole bunch of plots on all these DSLRs out there at various ISO levels, and they'll show you, you know, your full well depth is compressing as you're increasing the ISO, but hey, your read noise is going down a little bit, right? So, you know, there's advantages and disadvantages.
So I see we're at 10:38, and we've got some great questions in here, but I'm going to try and copy and paste these to a document, so I'll have them for some future episodes.
You know, you can save one of the functions of this one of the functions of this little messaging screen is that you can actually save the entire thread.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one of them down there. And I was going to bring that up. There are a number of people that pitched in, and when I was sitting here bumbling about, well, who did this, who did that, right? Well, they said, well, here, dummy, here it is, right here. And they posted it up here. So, like Victor, you asked, you know, where are these different resources? And you know, save this stream and then go back and you can get them more easily later. I forget which of the little
up arrow.
Yeah.
Up arrow, export the conversation as HTML file.
Yeah. Okay. So one of your icons in the lower left of the window does that for you.
Awesome. So yeah, I don't want to have this run on too long. I am coming off a work bender with my brother having his baby and all. So I've saved them off. If we have an open session in the next few weeks, then I'll definitely just start right at the beginning with those. But I am hoping, and I'm going to reach out to you guys one more time, I'm hoping we have some people step up with presentations. It's always hard to get something together, but if you have a good idea, basically, no matter what the topic is, whatever your expertise is, or your non-expertise in it, let us know. We'll get you scheduled. Thanks again for watching. Next week, well, look midweek for something to be posted. And have a good night.